This woman in the mask is Fatima, Jumbe Fatima. She is of partial Malagasy origin, and she ruled one of the most important places in Africa as an island, and that is the Comoros Islands. In that time, one of the places was named Mwani, and she negotiated with the Europeans that wanted power over these regions. She not only did this, but she outsmarted them over and over again, only finding some frailty, the French finding some frailty when she was ousted, thus forcing her back into her position where she ruled until her death. So, what is so amazing about this woman that makes her rule? Well, first of all, she comes from a great stock. Radama the First, who was in charge of Madagascar, was her, I guess, father's brother, her uncle, and Radama the Second was her cousin. So she already came from a pretty royal family that ruled Madagascar, but she ruled the Comoros Islands. Now, like I said, the Europeans wanted power over this place, but like every other African person, they sensed danger at every corner. Even when the Europeans tried to sell the idea that they would be living in a greater place under the Europeans, they denied this wholeheartedly, unlike some other kingdoms that accepted this deal a long time ago. And of course, the Europeans who were responsible for this tried to put in their own governors, as they do in all other parts of Africa, so that they can take over through that governor. So, in other words, you put in a fake governor who they think is as native as they are, but you trained them to allow the Europeans to come in and take over. But this did not happen. The governor that was sent by these Europeans was expelled by her. Her strategic course is something that is kind of unmatched in history. Now, you might think the way she's dressed is because she is picking some kind of tribal thing, but in real life, it's because, as one of the people describes, she is going through some kind of illness or some kind of condition, and she decided to cover up her body except one arm. As you can see, the people in the back are openly covered up, and it's not because she's a Muslim. She was a Muslim, but that's not because she was a Muslim. And of course, you can see that her being in charge, her first of all picking husbands and then divorcing them, that means that she was actively going, I would say, against Islam, a lot of Islamic doctrines, where she was well in charge of really hundreds of thousands of men, which is probably fine because she could do whatever she wanted. Now, there was a missionary who wanted to convert this place. There was a there was basically a person, a Christian, who wanted to convert this place, and at first had conversations with her father. Now, it's easy to assume that this man, Ramanteka Revo, accidentally gave this power to a female, and that was a once in a lifetime thing. By the way, Ramanteka Revo is her father, but this was not an accident in the sense that there was already a way for females to be in charge, as we've talked about females that were in charge of Madagascar and several nations in the east coast of Africa, even though they were Muslim. So, what happened? Why is it that a woman could rule? Well, also, someone who was regent at the time, who ruled along her, among with her, was her or his wife until obviously she married someone else and left. This is something that's very important to show that power was not necessarily immediately declared to men, even though there was an ascension. The majority of rulers, and I'll say it loud and clear, the majority of rulers of anywhere in Africa were men. But with a lot of areas, you see the scattering of women. And I think it's important, again, for me to point out in the 1800s how many there were, because there was tens of them all over Africa, scattered in 100 years. There was more before that, but I want to emphasize how many were squeezed into one time. And of course, the missionary that I was talking about, when he came to Madagascar, he first had a conversation with a man, which was the her father, Fatima's father, and then when he came back, he found, guess what? A girl sitting on the throne being driven by another woman as a regent. Big surprise, big shock. And of course, she did not take as easily as her father did. So this became a problem for the French. If we read from Wikipedia, we can see some realities, which is Ravio and Chivandini divorced in 1846. Mayotte had recently been ceded to France, and the French, eager to develop their presence on Mohili, arranged for a Madame Droit to serve as governess for Jumbe. The French also arranged for her coronation at the age of 12 in 1849. 2 years later, she expelled the governess and married Said Mohammed Nasser Mukadder, who was cousin to Zanzibar Sultan Mukadder. Mukadder became prince consort and ruled with Fatima until 1860, when he was ousted by the French. Fatima held on to the throne, marrying two sultans. She renounced the throne for her son. In 1863, the French government sent a delegation to meet with her, Jumbe Soli, and the event was recorded by a visiting photographer, Desire Carney. He recorded that she seemed melancholy and sickly and had a number of attendants. She was dressed extremely finely in a robe of rich Turkish tissue of silk and gold. Her dress covered most of her face, with only her hand visible. The purpose of the visit had been to impress upon the young queen the advantages of becoming a French colony. She resisted. Jumbe Soli lived in the palace overlooking the sea, next to which was the garrison, a white building of 2 rooms which held 28 soldiers. When the French returned in 1871, she was restored to the throne and ruled until her death in 1878. Now, the story might seem accidental, like how she came into power, and so you might think, oh yeah, 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 she was definitely the first woman in the Comoros Islands to ever rule. She was not the first, and she was not the last. In fact, there had been a series of queens with the exact same name that ruled for quite some time, and their names were Alimna. Alimna the first, the second, the third, and the fourth ruled, and they didn't. The first three ruled, you know, in succession a little bit. The first one ruled on her own, and then there was a couple men. Then the other one was Alimna the second, who came in, and then after her was Alimna the third, and then there was a gap, and then there was Alimna the fourth. These were the first female rulers of these these islands, this place. Now, like I said, she was not the last. This is Salima Machambia. I don't know how to say her last name, but she was one of the last sultanates of the Comoros Islands that was native and before independence, and then you get back to the rule of the natives. But before this, the the this woman was being used, and not like in her ignorance. She knew she was being used, but she was being used by the French to so that the natives could accept the power of the French and colonization. So they used her as a face, a fake governor, while they ran things. And when it was time to fully take over, they got rid of her and basically took over themselves and used other puppets as well. Like I said, they did this in several nations in history where they like, yeah. But you might ask yourself a question: why use a woman? Why did they go ahead and use a woman? Well, it's because they learned from the female herself, Fatima, that these people's culture is a little different than what they thought it was. And so they utilized the strategy that was there. But this tells you how open the natives were to female rulership. And again, this is just a continuation of something bigger. In Africa, this is how things work. But the colonization is not a good thing. And remember, there were tons of female queens that resisted. I've shown you from South Africa, Congo, Zimbabwe, all of these nations. There were females who resisted with all the power that was given to them, and some had quite a bit of power and they resisted very well. It was not just a war between men and women, and it was not just a war between two factions of men of different kinds. It was a war of everybody, and they were fighting for their lives. Even in West Africa, you see strong women coming in and stepping up. I would say Africa is a strange place, but really the rest of the world operated like this until they decided to go in their own direction, in a westernly direction and in a Middle Eastern direction. Because if you go and look in the Americas, you will find queens. If you go and look in the Austronesians, you will find queens. If you go and look in East Asia, you will find queens. But at some point, the Abrahamic faiths convinced the whole world that, you know, this is a man's world. Now, again, no problem with men. Men are awesome. And we have done some fairly great things in the world. But let us not overlook the power of the African woman and her ability and responsibility to change things and not allow people to stress